Good morning, Berne. This is Ingrid Piller speaking to you from Sydney in Australia. Very sorry I can't be with you in person today. If I were there, and speaking to you in person, I would look something like this. The reason I'm showing you this picture is because embodiment is very important to what I'll be talking about today, and so that you don't just hear an embodied voice. Here's an image. Now, why embodiment is important to the question of performance and perception in intercultural communication is related to the fact that there is a significant tension between the way we see the way linguistic proficiency is performed by the speaker and is expressed, and the way linguistic proficiency is perceived by the interlocutor. It's a question that I will explore with you in the next 30 minutes and that I explore in much more detail in my book, Intercultural Communication, the cover of which you can see here on the slide. Traditionally, embodiment in linguistics has not been receiving all that much attention. You are probably all familiar with this image from Saussure's Cours de linguistique générale, where we have this idea of communication, linguistic communication, being as perfect transfer of communication between two talking heads. As you'll see in the image, the two talking heads are identical. They're stylized images. There is no attention being paid to any aspects of the personal identity of the speaker or the interlocutor. We kind of can guess that they're both male by the look of it. They're both white. They seem to have a strange haircut, and we don't know anything else about them. However, in reality, of course, we never communicate as disembodied talking heads. We communicate as representatives, or we communicate also with our bodies. We see each other as people of a particular gender, of a particular ethnicity, of a particular age, of particular looks. In addition, what the what the diagram isn't paying attention to either is, of course, the relationship between these two people. We don't know what they are doing below their necks. Are they holding hands and gazing into each other's eye, fondly gazing into each other's eyes, or are they rather holding guns at each other? So all these aspects of embodiment would actually significantly influence the way the communication between these two people unfolds. Wittgenstein has kind of alerted us to the fact that the way we understand things is always a matter of perspective and always a matter of the ways of seeing, with his idea of, he brought this particular image to prominence, the optical illusion it presents, the way we can see it either as a duck or a rabbit. So what we hear, what we see is always something that is mediated through the ideologies and we have in our heads. It is mediated through our minds. And that's true of any reality, that's true of any meaning-making system, that's true of all language, and it is also true of linguistic proficiency, as I will now go on to show.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all.
It's an illusion.
It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see.
not on the basis of the sound, but on the basis of the lip shape.
But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
I'm going to show you a short video produced by the BBC because they have much better technical resources to explain this beautifully
Have
to
a
you
look
than
at
I
this.
have. So
What do you hear?
let's watch what the McGurk effect is all about and have it explained by the BBC.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, 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 ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba, ba.
It's an illusion known as the McGurk Effect.
Ba,
Take another look.
ba,
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
ba,
Now to the left of the screen.
ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing. Ba, ba, ba.
It's a bizarre effect. Remember, the only sound you're hearing is ba with a B.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's remarkable about this illusion is even knowing how it's done doesn't seem to make a difference.
Ba. The effect works no matter how much you know about the effect. I've been studying the McGurk effect for 25 years now, and I've been the face in the stimuli. I've seen stimuli thousands and thousands of times, but the effect still works on me. I can't help it. The speech brain just takes in that information and doesn't care about what outside knowledge you bring to bear. Ba, 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 ba.
The McGurk effect shows us that what we hear may not always be the truth.
Ba,
But it also helps us to understand what happens when our senses conflict.
ba, ba, ba. When the brain has the conflicting information, it tries to make sense of that conflict. And depending on what type of modality is providing more, I guess, salient information, that information might override or at least combine with the other information.
So we can't always trust what we hear, because sometimes our sense of vision takes over, enabling us to maintain a coherent view of the world.
Visual information in the form of a mouth shape may seem relatively low level to you, and maybe it's not that surprising that our brain overrides the spoken information that we hear when it conflicts with the mouth shape. However, what happens when we look at more complex aspects of visual signals that are delivered as the embodiment of the speaker, as I'll focus in my examples now on the ethnic identity of the speaker. And in particular, I want to examine what happens when Asians are seen as speaking English. So I'll be drawing on two pieces of research here. One is famous study by Donald Rubin in the 1990s, who examined at a time when teaching assistants started to when there were more and more Asian teaching assistants in the US, there was also an attendant language panic, kind of, that these teaching assistants weren't teaching American students properly because their English wasn't good enough. And so he was interested in finding out whether there really was a problem with the English delivery of those teaching assistants from Asia. And he set up an ingenious study where he audio recorded a short psychology lecture of a few minutes, and it was recorded by an American woman, a native speaker of American English or standard American English with a Midwestern accent. And that audio recording was then played to two different groups of undergraduate students. Now, one group of undergraduate students saw, while they heard the recording, they saw the image of a Caucasian woman, and the other group of undergraduate students saw the image of an Asian woman. Both women had been selected as being similarly attractive, and the idea that was created in the students' minds was that in one case, the lecture was being delivered by the Caucasian woman, and in the other case, it was delivered by the Asian woman. Now, after they'd listened to the lectures, the two groups of students received a little questionnaire where they were asked about what they thought about the lecture, how well they understood it, what they thought of the delivery, how well they had comprehended the content, and overall whether they had felt they had learned anything from the lecture. Now, I guess you can already guess where this is going. In the case of the Caucasian woman, the students commented on the clear delivery style. They found the lecture well organized, and they felt they had learned quite a lot. So they evaluated the lecture positively. Now, in the second scenario, and keep in mind this was exactly the same audio recording, it was just delivered against a different visual stimulus. And that different visual stimulus was the picture of an Asian woman. In that case, many students all of a sudden didn't understand the lecture anymore. A number of them commented that it was very difficult to comprehend. Some specifically said that there was an Asian accent that made it difficult to understand. As a result of having understood the lecture poorly, they also or related to that, they also felt that the lecture was poorly delivered. They criticized the organization of the lecture and felt that it was repetitive and circular and kind of all over the place. And they also evaluated their overall learning experience negatively. So they felt they hadn't learned all that much. So clearly what we see here is a kind of a McGurk effect on a broader level, that the quality of a lecture is evaluated differently on the basis of what kind of visual stimulus it is related to. So to sum up, Rubin's study showed that students who saw an Asian teacher heard an Asian accent, whatever that may be, and that perceived accent led to reduced overall comprehension and reduced learning. Now, let's move on to another study that one of my PhD students conducted here in Sydney a few years ago. Ikoko Nakane was interested in examining the learning experience of Japanese international students in Australian higher education. She conducted her research in the early 2000s, at the time when there was a relatively high number of Japanese students in the Australian system. And also against language ideologies and a language debate that often sees international students as kind of privileged kids who are not paying attention all that much, and not particularly interested, and who are kind of overall bringing Australian higher education down. And when Ikoko asked Japanese students themselves, what their kind of experience in Australian higher education was, many of them actually said that they couldn't kind of benefit enough because they felt they were shy and silent. The way they explained their silence was related to aspects of their language proficiency. They often said they weren't confident in their English. They said that, or they didn't know local classroom norms. They felt that, discussion was kind of inappropriate, and they would have preferred to some sort of lecture style where they listened to the teacher as opposed to the kind of discursive style that is favored in Australian classrooms. Um, and likewise, when she interviewed or conducted a survey of lecturers at the university where she conducted the study, the lecturers also all said, the main problem of Japanese students is that they are so silent, they are so shy, they never speak up. And the lecturers took that as a sign of being disengaged and disinterested, not as a sign of lacking confidence in their language proficiency or in the or understanding of classroom norms. So what Ikoko then did was she got permission to follow 5 Japanese students throughout one term and record all the seminars and tutorials and lectures in which these students, participated. Now, of course, that created a huge amount of data, and she was only able to analyze 2 aspects of those data. One was she counted how often any student in all those classes that these 5 students attended, how often any student volunteered a contribution. And then she counted how the average length of those volunteered student contributions. What she found was that there was significant variation, of course, and what she also found was that there was significant variation across the 5 Japanese students. But mostly they were actually quite close to the average. There were 2 extremes. One was a male student who actually fully conformed to the stereotype. So he was super quiet, rarely volunteered any contribution throughout the semester, and when he spoke, it was very, very brief. However, what she found out through her recordings was that it actually required a whole lot of work to kind of be as shy and silent as he was. And like one of his strategies included he would sit in tutorials and seminar rooms, like when there was a U shape, he would sit next to the teacher so that he was kind of outside of the field of vision of the teacher. So that was one extreme. The other extreme was a female Japanese student who volunteered, who was the second most frequent volunteer of all the students, Japanese, local, any other overseas student. So she was the second most frequently volunteering student in all the classrooms that she attended, and her contributions were precisely average. And now that's where the interesting finding occurred, because then in another step, the teachers of that particular student were also interviewed, and the teachers actually didn't notice that this particular student was speaking up basically more often than any other student, with the exception of one, and that her contributions were exactly of average length. On the contrary, they still argued that she was very shy, that she was really reticent, and that she was being held back by her silence. Some teachers actually interpreted this as being disengaged. So, and disinterested in the content of her classes. So to sum this up, that particular study showed that there is a perception of silence, even if this particular student, in the case of the student who spoke with above average frequency and exactly average turn length. And again, the perceived silence was evaluated as a lack of interest and a lack of student engagement. So let's move on to ask now, where do these perceptions come from? How are these perceptions being maintained? And there is a whole area of Orientalist discourse that actually creates in our minds a filter that makes us see Asians as speaking English in particular ways. And one of those Orientalist discourses that shape the frames in our minds about the language proficiency of Asians is tourism discourse. I'm going to give you an example from another study that a PhD student of mine, Xiao Chen, conducted. And she was interested in examining how travel reports in the New York Times about travel reports to China, how the travel writers were writing about the English language proficiency of anyone they encountered in China. And what she discovered was that the English proficiency was always downplayed. So travel reports in the New York Times consistently portrayed a picture of very limited English language proficiency in China and of Chinese interlocutors, even of tour guides. As in this example, often the travel logs were in a humorous tone. And the example here is from a report from the New York Times in 2005, where the travel writer arrives in Guilin and writes the following about the tour guide who was an English speaker and was there to guide that particular English speaking tour. And so the travel writer says, an American travel writer, I should add, having spent several days in Hong Kong, we are unprepared for the size of the language barrier that confronts us. Nothing in my life could have prepared me for communication difficulties of this magnitude. A young girl, Jean, with a lovely face and a voice that could singe the hair out of your nose, greets us at the airport. We go to Shell, she tells us, nodding happily. Big soft head. She gestures something round and, yes, big. I look at Harper. Maybe he understood what I didn't, but no such luck. He manages to shrug helplessly. She tries again, her voice getting into places in your skull where previously only migraines could go. Big head, soft shell, you see. You see that language proficiency, our perception of language proficiency, or the reader's language perceptions of language proficiency, is shaped in discourses about the language proficiency of Chinese people. Now, this is not only something that is going on in the examples that I've shown you so far from Australia, from the United States, but also in Switzerland. And I've as some of you may know, I was part of a larger study on tourism discourses in Switzerland a few years ago. And the example I'm going to show you now is from a leaflet that is produced by Swiss Tourism, and that is aimed at Swiss hotels and kind of any Swiss tourism providers who provide tourism services to Chinese guests. The brochure is called Hello China, Swiss Hospitality for Chinese Guests. And I thought you might be interested to see what the advice regarding English language proficiency in that particular brochure is. So the key thing that Swiss tourism providers are told about the language proficiency of Chinese people is that they understand very little English. So on page 18 of the brochure, it says, although ever more young Chinese people speak much better English than the older generation, most Chinese understand only little English. The remedy for that particular intercultural communication problem then is to express yourself slowly and in an intelligible manner without interrupting the other party. So that's presumably in English. A further kind of remedy is actually for Chinese people to speak Chinese. It must be stressed just how much the Chinese appreciate it and feel flattered when Westerners make the effort to try and understand and respect Chinese culture and attempt to speak their language. I think all the data that we have on international language proficiency suggests that English language proficiency in China, particularly of Chinese people who can afford to go and travel to Switzerland, is actually much higher than the Chinese language proficiencies of Westerners in general and the Swiss population in particular. Now, of course, the more practical advice, I suppose, for the kind of intercultural communication problem that is addressed here, that results from lack of language proficiency in a mutual language, is to use an interpreter. And in the study that I referred to, we also spoke to all kinds of marketing people who were actually targeting the Chinese market. And one, the marketing director of a hospitality school, which we've given the pseudonym LHS, spoke to us about the kind of marketing efforts he undertakes at education fairs when he goes to Asia. And what he stresses is that he needs an interpreter, but he doesn't speak about the interpreter as a language professional. He speaks about the interpreter as an Asian face. So this particular guy was actually a white person from white male from North America. And so he says, so for me, standing at an education fair, and he was referring to education fairs in Asia, I must have an Asian face beside me. I must have somebody who speaks their language. And what I do, I am the credibility. I am the director of marketing. So I am the important guy, you know. They look at me and this person speaks. And so I might telling them what to say, blah, blah, blah. So he actually quite nicely encapsulates in the way he spoke about his marketing efforts. He quite nicely encapsulates what I've been trying to speak about in this presentation, that in a sense, he provides the face. And the other face, the Asian face, provides the language. But together it's about hearing a white face and I suppose still being spoken to in Chinese. So to sum this all up, why does the question of hearing faces and seeing accents in the performance and perception of linguistic proficiency and intercultural communication matter? Well, first of all, I think we need to bear in mind that linguistic proficiency is constituted in the dialectic of performance and perception. So there is no such thing as all kinds of language tests make us believe, and as many of us believe, that language proficiency is the property of the speaker. It is not. Language proficiency is something that is created and recreated and constituted and reconstituted in interaction, and it is something that is jointly mediated through the minds of the two or more interlocutors. In the specific case studies that I looked at, the perception of language proficiency in communication between Asians and Westerners is undergirded by ways of seeing that derive from Orientalist discourses. And many of these discourses are continue to be produced and reproduced in contemporary tourism discourses. And I should add, not only tourism discourses, but also in those discourses about international higher education that I showed you earlier. What this means for linguistic research, in my view, is that linguistic research really needs to make much more efforts and needs to become much better at incorporating embodiment and incorporating the question of embodiment both conceptually and methodologically. To my mind, this is essential for linguistic research to remain socially relevant as we try to understand language between performance and perception. Thank you very much for your attention. And I know that I'll be joining you on FaceTime in a second. So hopefully that works and we'll get a chance to speak some more, and I'll be able to ask some of your questions or receive your comments. Thank you very much for your attention.